All right, so we're going to get going now. So for those of you that don't know that track or those DJs, that's Sash and Dig. We made a request so I thought I'd go old school, which is a duo that I used to listen to a long time ago. So for those of you into that stuff, that's pretty classic, going back probably circa, geez, 1998, maybe something like that. We'll see. So anyway, tonight what we're going to talk about is we're recording now. It's values, valuation, and sustainable development. So, and the reason why I chose to talk about this tonight is because it's relevant to both of the courses, particularly 322 for the economic valuation aspect, and then on 660, I think it relates to the valuation and values. Certainly, the values component of that has a lot to do with differential values in environmental management and climate change, because you have to deal with different stakeholders when you're looking at environmental management implementation in an organization, and a lot of people will have dramatically different views on that issue, and so we're going to talk about that tonight. So first off, values. So values, the question we have to think about when we talk about values is, well, first and foremost, what are they? It's like, what do we, how do you define what a value is, like in terms of what we work on? And we all have them, and they're kind of tacit in many cases. We assume that people think in a certain way quite often, yet, we're often confronted with situations where people have dramatically different worldviews or opinions on what's right or what's wrong, or the way something should or should not go. So some of the things we need to think about are where do they come from? So like, why do people have certain sets of values, and how are they expressed, right? So like, to give an extreme example, like I've worked in the Middle East with clients from Saudi Arabia, and it was quite challenging when they came to Canada, because their view on a lot of different things, but particularly gender issues, was dramatically different than what we as a North American company did. So having women on our team was foreign for them. So that's how they expressed it. They expressed their different kind of ways of dealing with women, and by not, like in that case, not shaking hands with women. We didn't eat in the same room to start with, but that actually changed with that project as we went on. So that's an example of how those values were expressed in that certain situation. And this is, in our work, comes up a lot when we're looking at as environmental professionals. So what relevance do they have to sustainable development? Well, I'll tell you, they have a lot to do with it, and we'll get into that. So our use and perception of natural resources is completely dependent on our values. So for instance, whether or not we choose to exploit oil sands and have pipelines developed, and that's a values-based decision. Do we care to conserve? Like, is that something that we hold as a value, or do we recognize the rights of animals and nature as a whole? Like, is that is a strong value in a lot of people's mind, whereas in other folks it's not as strong. Are we fine with unfettered exploitation of nature, or is this just drill, pump, and chop down as much forest as we can in order to develop the economy? Or do we have a different way of viewing things? What about our views on social equity? That's a part of sustainable development. Do we believe that wealth should be distributed equally, or at least not equally, but in a way that there's not massive winners and massive losers? Or do we care about future generations? That's another big question for us. We could go and conduct our affairs without any concern for future generations or future climate experiences. So the issue of intergenerational equity is something we need to think about. So all of these issues are value-laden issues that we need to wrestle with, and they come to the surface in environmental impact assessment and other situations that often involve multiple stakeholders. So I want to talk a bit about different stakeholders, because this is stuff I deal with a lot, and in fact, it was staringly obvious last week at these UN meetings. And I'm going to give a specific, two examples I'm going to give tonight, talk about how different stakeholders, groups, or individuals even can have really dramatically different sets of values, and they're expressed differently. So what kind of stakeholders are there in sustainable development? Like, who do we deal with? Are we attempting to integrate the views of a bunch of individuals? Is it just people, or are there distinct groups? Well, in environmental impact assessment or strategic environmental assessment and environmental analysis, there tend to be distinct sets of groups. Like there's kind of bunches of types of groups that you work with, right? And they vary within those sets, but they are actually some general characteristics that are good to be aware of, particularly in the international context. So these are the groups: governments, NGOs, industry associations and unions, private sector companies, international government organizations, corporations, and civil society. Those are like the main ones that you end up dealing with when you're doing this kind of research or work. So the first one, governments, have characteristics. There's different types of governments. Just really it depends on who's elected, and we see that today, obviously, with some pretty unique government leaders in place. One general characteristic of a government is whether it's a realist or pluralistic government. So realist governments, this is like coming from political science, a realist is a hardline right-wing government. Typically, it's generally that a realist government or a realist entity in political science is one that is completely self-interested. So their interests are about their citizens and their country's own well-being, without interest for other parties. Now, you could say actually a good example of that right now would be the United States or the Trump government, because the approach that he, and this isn't going to be like a bashing session on Donald Trump, it's just a reality. If you want to look at the way he governs from a political science standpoint, he's a realist. And that is that they are operating under their own interests, what they are most interested in. So multilateralism, for instance, like dealing with the commons globally, or contributing to multilateral organizations like NATO, for instance, or the UN, that's not something that a realist government is really keen on, because it's not directly related to their own interests necessarily. Pluralist governments, on the other hand, are open to international collaboration, and they have a greater sense of the global common good. They tend to be a little more intercultural and multicultural. In EIA, governments are responsible to the people they serve or mandate they uphold to govern. So, like, even if it's a pluralistic government or a realist government, the EIA process is typically driven towards the needs of that country. They generally have the ultimate say, responsibility on the land in which environmental impacts occur. So it's the government will, like, good examples is the Trans-Canada Pipeline. That ultimately has been approved through a federal go-ahead, despite the fact that the province of British Columbia has opposed it, as have many First Nations groups. It's been greenlit through the government, which is constitutional, but nonetheless, I mean, the point is that the government has played a very significant role in that project going forward. But they also have responsibilities to global organizations, or what's called conventions, like the UNFCCC or Convention on Biodiversity. And we'll look at Convention on Biodiversity. So convention is an international legally binding agreement amongst different stakeholders who are all parties to that convention, or countries. The country is a party to the convention. NGOs is a second group. They have a variety of mandates. Not one NGO is the same as the rest of them. Generally focused on a specific issue or cause. They can be advocacy-based or neutral or objective. It really depends on the NGO. So you've got to be very careful if you're dealing with a situation where there's multiple stakeholders to some NGOs. You've got to understand each one. Often seen as the voice of those not heard on an issue, like, say, habitat conservation for, say, WWF or Wildlife Fund. They tend to be financed through donors or through grants or funds. That's how they exist financially. And they can also perform consulting. So it kind of depends on which one you're dealing with. So there's some examples here. They can be very influential in international EIA, big time. In fact, some of the key issues causing an EIA, like if there is an EIA to be conducted internationally, it's often, like, if there's no legislation in place, quite often it's an NGO that's brought that issue to the forefront, to public attention. So some examples are the WWF. It's a great NGO. Like, I've worked in collaboration with them, and I really have a lot of time for them. They're focused on conservation issues is what their main thing is, but they're very visible, very credible, and very proactive. And they tend to be open to collaboration with a variety of different organizations, even corporations and governments. So they tend to be heavily, like, have a lot of professional staff, and they tend to be, there's a give and take with them. And, like, they've done collaborations with Coca-Cola and so forth. Careful collaborations, but nonetheless, they will do that. They want to make sure everything's above the board before they get involved. Other examples, one is called the IUCN, International Union for Conservation of Nature. Pretty conservation driven, very well respected. They do some top-notch work in terms of literature on ecosystem services, conservation, and development. And they're often part of international policy research projects, so they get involved. In fact, at this last meetings I was at last week, I was sitting behind the IUCN, and I met a lot of them, and they're good. They're funded by governments, IGOs, and various foundations and funding bodies. So that's how they exist. They get grants and so forth from different groups to do their work. They're not selling things per se. Another example is the WRI. So WRI is World Resource Institute. They're in the United States in DC, focused on understanding human environment interactions, very well respected, very broad scope. So they're not like WWF, which tends to be focused on some more conservation oriented issues. They do a lot of energy work, a lot of business issues, governance and technology and innovation. Pretty high profile international presence. They weren't at the, they're at the COPs quite often. And they get a lot of good stuff done. So they do a good job. Greenpeace is an NGO, so they tend to be more on the advocacy side of things. So advocating for environmental protection, often viewed by a lot of people as radical. In fact, I met one of the founders of Greenpeace. He lectured, he did a guest lecture at Royal Roads back when I was an undergrad a long time ago, and it was interesting because he's certainly, some of you may know who I'm talking about, but he's mellowed now. He's more of an industry guy. He's no longer in Greenpeace. Patrick, I forget his last name, but it's an interesting organization, and we do need like extreme radicals. I think to really kind of raise some issues to the forefront. They through their campaigns, they're just phenomenal at running campaigns. I wouldn't say they're the best organization for collaboration and solutions-oriented environmental management. It's not the right group to work with, I would say. But if you want to have a company's if you want someone to get nailed for doing bad stuff in the environment, call Greenpeace because they'll get it done. Like it's Nestle. They just went to town on them for the palm oil. Next stakeholder groups, industry associations. This is one that you don't think about a lot, but they're very powerful. Active advocates for their industry. They be an excellent source of practical information. It's relevant to EIA, so carbon footprinting, life cycle analysis. A lot of publications come out of those groups that you use for doing that kind of work. Really influential in policy development. They were there at these meetings last week, the oil and gas industry associations. But their mandate is ultimately self-preservation of their industry. So that's really what they're about. They're open to collaboration. They want to see the state of whatever it is. The research in this case last week was biodiversity conservation, but they want to see their industry continue going on. So if it's like, say, an industry that is you think is inherently unsustainable, like maybe oil sands or something like that, if that's your position, then their position is to keep that going. Mining Association is another one, Mining Association of Canada, towards sustainable mining. They do some interesting work in these areas to try and improve their industrial performance. American Petroleum Institute, I've used their stuff before for sustainability reporting and carbon footprinting. So they produce some good literature, and they have really bright people working for them. CAP is one for a lot of you in Alberta would know about CAP, Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. They lobby pretty extensively for, like this one here is the Canadian Oil Sands, Get the Real Story. And then another one here is the International Council of Chemical Associations, and they have produced the Responsible Care Program, which is like one of the very early forms of environmental management tools going quite far back. It's stuff that I covered like 20 years ago. So, I mean, they're the ones because they had to respond. This is Silent Spring, Rachel Carson's book, that really pushed them to come up with responsible care. World Business Council for Sustainable Development, WBCSD, they're a more progressive group, and they are just about business and sustainability. They've got something going on this week in New York City with the Sustainable Development Goals, high-level meetings, and they'll be running an event there. I think it's today, actually, or tomorrow. And they've done some good work with corporate ecosystem evaluation and procedures that relate to sustainability in business. Very business oriented, they're very, very professional. Unions, stakeholder group 4. Again, very powerful. Promotion of the rights of workers, so focus on labor, heavy lobbyists. They will promote what is best for the industry with a focus on the workers of that industry. They can be a strong advocate for environmental health and safety, particularly workplace safety. So some of the folks in certain unions have been pushing like sustainability of the workplace and a lot of progressive climate change stuff. Surprisingly, they've really been advocates for that. So, I mean, you've got to take that into consideration because even in history, unions have a tremendous amount of power, especially in Quebec. Canadian Auto Workers Union, CAW, largest private sector union in Canada. Any environmental issue that will affect labor in Canada will have the CAW involved, for sure. United Steelworkers Union, another famous union, and then they're an advocate for the industrial workers, promote environment, health, and safety with a focus on labor. So if you go to the US, this website that I've listed there, they'll give you a little more. They've got really well-refined policies for all of these issues. International governmental organizations is the fourth group. They are designed and exist for global governance of issues concerning multiple different government groups. That's why they're international governmental organizations. Can have a broader, narrow focus, comprised of sovereign states, and they're a means of managing international issues in a global society. Like climate change is not a national issue. It is, but it's a global issue. So you need to have these IGOs in order to deal with them. Often criticized for being overly bureaucratic and ineffective, but in many cases, these criticisms are poorly informed. But in their defense, because I've worked with many of these folks, there is some truth to some of those things. It really depends on how they run their show. The UN, there's one UNEP. UN is big. Like there's a lot of different UN organizations. UNEP, UN Environment, UN Development Program, UNFAO, UNIDO. There's a lot of different groups, even pertaining to the environment. There's at least probably 12, 15, or 20 different UN organizations that you could potentially deal with. WTO, World Trade Organization, is about a negotiating platform for which countries can resolve trade issues. WTO is a big issue right now with all the trade wars that are going on. But EIA is increasingly a big part of these decisions because trade, like for instance, the CEC in Canada, the Commission for Environmental Cooperation, came out of a trade deal. When NAFTA was ratified between Mexico, Canada, and the United States, they had to, by law, come up with a government agency or like a trilateral government organization that was intended on assessing and monitoring environmental impacts across those three countries because they thought that they'd outsource all this work to Mexico because they'd have more lax environmental policies. That was the risk, right? One of the concerns. So that would be a trade-related environmental issue that came out. Corporations. So engines of the economy that provide jobs, obviously, often the source of many environmental impacts, a lot of them. Increasingly, though, a catalyst for sustainable development and innovation. It depends on the industry, and usually the proponent side of the international EIA. So when we're doing any kind of international environmental impact assessment or implementing tools, they're going to be the ones who is considered to be the proponent in the situation, the one that's needs to do the environmental management system. And lastly, civil society. So these are citizens of the world in international situations or citizens of Canada if it's national. May be subjected to environmental degradation. That may be the issue that they're confronted with, may be opposing social and environmental injustice elsewhere. Civil society can apply pressure to governments through voting, corporations through market forces who you choose to purchase from or lobby against, non-government organizations, and international government organizations. So civil society is way more powerful than it used to be because of connectivity. So people can mobilize a lot easier now than they used to be able to. Social media is really, look at the Arab Spring is a good example. The Maple Spring for the students here in Montreal, I'm in Montreal right now, all kind of influenced by the connectivity associated with social media and how that brings together different groups. So civil society is an extremely much more powerful force than it was before in these issues, in these situations. So mapping, so how do we put these things together? How will these groups respond to situations given they have different values? In any given situation, you're most likely going to get differential values. There'll be different perspectives and values of nature or proposed policies. And frankly, like this works, it's a messy business. When I started out, I had more of an idealistic vision of things, whereas now, you just see so many situations where it's just there's no right or wrong. It's kind of a series of trade-offs that we have to make in every given situation. So the best thing one can do, from my experience, is to attempt to understand how each of the groups works and what their mandates or values are. And hence, like if you look at those stakeholder groups I listed, each one has a different characteristic. So if you're thrown into a situation where you have Greenpeace over here and you have the unions over here, and then you have the government here, and then you have the IGOs here, you try and figure out, what they're about, like, what's driving their agenda. And then from this, what you can try and do, if the ideal is to try and find a common ground between those groups, or not. Sometimes it just doesn't work, right? So valuation. And I'm going to talk about values and going to get into valuation. Valuation is a loaded topic, and I'm not going to get fully into it, but I just want to bring it up because the example I'm going to talk about is about valuation. So one topic that's hotly debated right now, and we've talked about this a bit in 322, and we'll talk about this more in 660, is that specifically the economic valuation of nature is a hot topic right now, right? So an example of that is carbon taxation in Canada, or anywhere for that matter. And then in addition to that, all the other issues like say payment for environmental services or paying people to conserve land through avoided deforestation and so forth. So there's different schools of thought on this subject, and it's frankly it's a whole course, if not a degree unto itself. It's a lot. I mean, it goes down to the fundamentals of economics, but there's some general rules with respect to different views that people have in regard to valuation. So instrumental value is like what is what can you use this for? Like, what do you get out of this as a society? Like, the instrumental value of this tree is that we can cut it down and make boards out of it and make a house, right? Our relational value is a little more nuanced because it brings in cultural context. You could say, well, this tree here, we could use it to this. We could use it to chop it down and build a house with the boards and so forth. But there's also other factors that come into it that constitute our relationship with that tree as a society and a culture, right? So relational value gets a little more interesting when you look at say First Nations groups or traditional groups, and they have like say spiritual value attached to that same tree, right? So there's a relationship. It's a relational value. Intrinsic value is a type of value that is just it's not putting any kind of utilitarian value on it. It's just something has value unto itself, right? Like nature, intact nature has a value unto itself, and trees hasn't moving carbon. Yeah, that's another way of looking at it. Yeah, like Arslan, a tree. You could say that tree has an instrumental value of sequestering carbon from the atmosphere. Exactly right, right, and that's what RED is based on. Reduced emissions from ecosystem degradation, deforestation is about trees sucking up carbon when they grow and then not allowing it to be released into the atmosphere. But you know what? People even have a problem with that. And I'm good. My example speaks to that. So I'll get to that. And then lastly is hedonic value. And there's other ways. These are just some of the main ones that jumped out at me. And hedonic value is where you're doing substitution value. So you say like, you look at something that is similar to something to derive a value. Like a good example for hedonic valuing is views. Like if say in real estate, you could say the value of this pristine coastline is the amount of increase in value you get for the property, right? The property values are much greater, say 25% greater here because of the view than opposed to like say 2 miles away because they don't have that view, and you can use that as a proxy for how much that kind of intact view is worth. It's called hedonic valuation, roughly. So economic valuation approach is a perfect issue for which we can see how values are exercised in policy. So many NGOs would refuse the idea of economic valuation of nature altogether. Doug Ford's fight against federal carbon, likely doom. Okay, Michael, thanks for that. That's going to be an interesting fight. Like this, Doug Ford's working on a project right now that's looking at like potentially tapping into some Ontario's programs, and I think they're all going to be axed personally. So we'll see though. It's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. So many NGOs will refuse the idea altogether. Say no way. We don't want to have any kind of economic valuation because it's against our values. Like a Greenpeace would probably say that, or there's other ones I know of. Other groups take a purely monetary approach. They say, fine, let's just like price this stuff and let the market decide. Still others see it as a practical solution, but it needs to be positioned in a sustainable development context that considers things like social equity and so forth. I tend to be in the third camp there. I see it as a necessary tool, but it needs to be managed properly. So, recent example. This is the real deal. So last week, I was in meetings for 2 weeks at what's called the United Nations Subsidiary Body for Implementation, SBI, for the UNCBD, Convention on Biodiversity. And the issue of valuation came right up to the fore. And when I say up to the fore, I mean like countries arguing over it. Right? So in the plenary meetings, the country participants were asked to comment on the text in what's called a CRP, conference room paper, that would then feed into the COP meeting in November. So the COP meeting is the conference of the parties where everybody gets together every 2 years. This next one's going to be in Egypt in November. I forget the name. It's not Cairo. It's something, I forget the name, but it's a big meeting, and that's where, if there's going to be changes to that agreement, that's where they will happen. So these meetings are a build up to that. We debate stuff, say, no, we can't have this. And then once we come to a conclusion, those documents, in this case, it's a conference room, Sharm el Sheikh, that's it. Sharm el Sheikh, yeah, that's it. That's where it is, Sharm el Sheikh. I think I'll go. I want to go. I've never been to Egypt, so I want to check it out. And so I'm going to try and arrange some project there. Um, so these meetings are kind of preparatory, and that stuff's going to go into what is actually decided upon there. So what coming out of these last two meetings, these documents could potentially feed into the legally binding documents that come out of a COP. Now, those documents are in the convention, like the convention text, for instance, and the protocols. They are legally binding technically, but they're difficult to enforce. If that makes any sense. So you're legally bound as a party when you sign onto the convention to do X, Y, Z, but no one's gonna. It's difficult for someone to come after you and like just sue you and say you didn't do this. We're gonna fine you. It's not the way it works. It's more kind of reputational. Nonetheless, like people do not like to like not fulfill their commitments. So here's the actual paper. So this is a conference room paper, literally from what was being debated. So imagine you're in a big, huge plenary like you see on TV with all the countries and the signs, and they've got different clothes on, like people from Africa with the hats, and then you've got the people from Southeast Asia or from the Fiji, and they're wearing kind of colorful shirts from Indonesia. It's exactly like it, you see it. It's exactly what it's like. And I was there in the business section and just kind of watching. I don't get to say anything because unless I request, but I chose just to watch and listen. And then during this section, this is what we're talking about in terms of values came like just hit the like it just came right to the fore, right? So this is a conference room paper, CRP3, and the title of this, and so they have an agenda and they go through these and they go through every single line and they say, does anybody have a problem with this line? And then the whole group, someone will press their button and say, I want to speak, and then they'll give their country will give their position, right? So this one was on mainstreaming of biodiversity within and across sectors and other strategic actions to enhance implementation. So this is about bringing biodiversity to sector activities. So basically considering this stuff in like mining and agriculture and so forth. So in this line here, so line 13A of this conference room paper, things got kind of, I wouldn't say crazy. It wasn't like a I don't know, like the Parliament of Taiwan, where they have fist fights. It wasn't like that, but it's like when they said, okay, 13A, this is a line to improve the internalization by business of the value of biodiversity in these sectors and to facilitate the sharing of experiences and good practices, right? So if you read that, it sounds kind of innocuous. You're like, okay, well, we're going to like internalize and we're going to suggest that businesses internalize the value of biodiversity in these sectors like agriculture or whatever, and then facilitate sharing of experiences. And that sounds great, right? No. As soon as they said that, said, who agrees to this? Or who does any have a problem with this? And boom, like then just lit up, right? So Brazil was adamantly opposed to this. They said value equates to commodification and monetization of nature, and we fundamentally oppose that in any way whatsoever. And and then Argentina and Brazil tend not to be, you know, friends at the best of times. And Argentina is a proponent of that. So you got this back and forth between these two, and it's exactly what I'm talking about, which is differential values being expressed in context of a decision. And they ended up having to go offline and kind of come up with a solution. So the chair says, okay, we're not getting anywhere. You guys got to sit down, Brazil, Argentina, and a few other countries that are trying to debate what this will be and come up with the wording that makes sense to you, right? So I actually went and talked to Brazil after that because it made no sense to me because I knew, I've worked in Brazil and done research there, and I know that they have payment for ecosystem service projects there. Like I know they have avoided deforestation projects there. So the fact that they oppose monetization of nature was weird because I know that they do it. So I still don't fully understand because when I talked to the woman who's the chief negotiator, I said, I don't understand what's going on with this. She's like, well, who are you? I said, well, this is me. I do this. I'm with this university and blah, blah, blah. And she says, well, they're not the same thing. And I'm like, well, I don't know. Like, it's still not completely clear to me what you oppose. But I think what they oppose is commodification. They don't want to see just sheer market value take over and drive decision making. So that's kind of a real how that stuff can actually happen. There's NGOs there, but there's not a lot of private sector folks, and very few are going to be giving interventions there. But that's literally like what will happen in those situations, and that ultimately will result in law, right? It's going to result in an international agreement that will then affect what happens in Canada and Brazil and Argentina and Southeast Asia, whatever. So I have one other story to tell. It's a little more dramatic about differential values. So this is story time. So back in 2010, and this is what happens when you're not aware of what different people might think. And this is my first time at a UN conference. So it was in 2010. It was in Japan in Nagoya. It's the UN CBD Convention for Biodiversity, same convention. COP 10, so the Conference of the Parties 10 in Nagoya in 2010. So I was presenting at a side event of the UN conference, and the project was a capacity development project with an NGO client. There's a heavy emphasis on sustainable development, biodiversity conservation, and gender empowerment. It's for the DRC, Democratic Republic of the Congo. That's where the project is. So in this meeting, and this is our last story, I'm going to finish off after this, were senior government officials from the DRC, so all the ministers and so forth. It's pretty high level, and it was my first time doing this, so it was kind of, I was pretty nervous, I guess you could say. In addition to that, this project was funded by Prince Albert of Monaco's foundation. So his high-level representatives were there because they're giving millions of dollars to this project, as well as a group called London for Africa. London is a mining company, and they have a foundation where they give money to African development. This is in the Congo, this project. It's a great project. So I was presenting on their environment program, their carbon program, and how they're going to manage all that kind of stuff. And so what happened was I did the presentation, and part of that was about access and benefit sharing. I did all the carbon stuff. This is how much carbon we'll save, blah, 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 blah. Then I talked about something called ABS, which is access and benefit sharing, which essentially means how is the genetic material going to be, the money made from genetic material in this land be equitably shared with local populations. Because in the past, companies have gone in, taken all this stuff, like all the valuable, say, genetic material like rare plants, and then synthesized chemicals and made drugs and then sold them and made like boatloads of money, and then the people in the ground get nothing. That's what has happened. ABS tries to address that through the Nagoya Protocol, which forces companies to get free and prior informed consent of local populations and then a deal. So the deal is how much money they will get for the exploitation of that resource. So I started to talk about ABS, which at the time was kind of getting going, it was still immature. And then out of nowhere, in front of all these dignitaries, this guy gets up and starts yelling at me. Gets in the mic and starts yelling, "Who benefits?" And I look over and I'm going, "What the hell is going on?" Like I was mortified, right? Because this is, the funder's there, everybody's there, and I've never dealt with. And it was a guy who was probably about 4'1", and he was a pygmy. Like he was, I'm trying to remember his name, Kapupu, I think his name is, yeah. And he was representing the Pygmy nations. The Pygmies are like the indigenous population of a large part of the Democratic DRC. And the Pygmies historically have been exploited like unbelievably in that region by the Belgians when they were running it as the colonialists. And to this day, they've got don't have much rights, right? So his job was to go there and advocate for the Pygmies. And as soon as he heard benefits and no mention of how the Pygmies were benefiting, he went ballistic, And so like I'm standing there shocked and not knowing. Unfortunately, my client colleague was a former Regine Fernet, who's a former ambassador to high-level ambassador to say like big profile, like to Switzerland, to Nigeria, to the United States, very very like seasoned diplomat. So he was able to come in and we talked to this guy offline afterwards and told him that we're not taking away anything. In fact, we're going to try and help them get involved as much as possible. But the thing is, the moral of the story is like I wasn't aware that they would be there, and I wasn't aware of the actual on-the-ground contextual historical issues of land tenure because they have a very poor land tenure system, so people don't know what they own there, and this is what the problem was. And I wore it that day, I did. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. I just I wasn't aware of what was happening, and I got caught. So the bottom line is values matter, and values matter big time. So if you don't pay attention to the political or social context you're working in, whether it be in the oil sands, whether it be in the DRC, whether it be in the Amazon, whether it be, in Ontario now, you may find yourself caught off guard like I was, and I was truly caught off guard. So try and be understanding of the different groups, even the ones you may not agree with. So for instance, the Monsantos of the world, like I've met Monsanto before. I've sat down with representatives from Monsanto at the conferences and stuff like that, and they have. You got to understand where they're coming from, and you got to know how they're doing what they're doing, and try and figure out. Even if you oppose it, at least you'll be educated in how you oppose it. So you're going to fare much better, and you're going to make more progress towards creating sustainable solutions by understanding the priorities and actions of the different parties involved, if you do your homework and kind of figure out who's involved, what's the history, what's the cultural context, and what the objectives of the different groups are. So tonight I've just given you a high-level view of what you'll quite often, generally speaking, find in these situations and how you might want to deal with some of these folks. I've learned through personal experience, and I'll get caught again. I know I will, but I'll try not to. So that's it. That's it for tonight. And how this relates to stuff we're working on each one of the courses. Context values are very important. Climate change adaptation and environmental management tools, very, very important, especially right now, because investors are getting spooked over this. They want to see action. So if you're putting environmental management tools in for a public company, they want to see it. That's the values are shifting in that direction. Regulators want to see stuff like that, and the general public is as well. In terms of the 322, the economic imperative of sustainable development is completely value-laden. So carbon taxation, any kind of economic incentives are going to be refuted or promoted depending on the government or depending on the NGOs that are involved. What we're seeing right now is a lot of pushback against carbon taxation because of the different governments that are opposed to it. And I can tell you that carbon taxation is one of the most cost-effective ways of dealing with greenhouse gas emissions. It is. In the literature, you can look at it and look at the models, and it is. And so if we're serious about it, we need to have that as one of the tools. And it will be regressive against climate change if we choose not to have it. Good. So does anybody have any questions? Enough talking from me. I really appreciate that story because it highlights an important issue when dealing with social imperative. Sorry, just a second. Not exclusive ecological or economic considerations. Yes. So the story of the Kapopo and the pygmy. Yeah. Yeah, I try and use that story when I can, when it fits in classes, because it was such a classic one, like new to the game and just like no idea. Like I didn't know the background. I mean, I was trying to figure out, I mean, I was new to that field, and it was tough enough getting that whole project together. Never mind like knowing the history of the DRC and and the pygmy situation. But there's plenty of resources you can tap into, so you're not caught. But yeah, I mean that social history is critical to know about. Any other questions? I had a surprising discussion about forest carbon sequestration today, where I was told that it was double dipping to use riparian areas set aside to meet regulations to be used for carbon offsets. Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay. So they're conserving, but then they're also benefiting from carbon offsets. Is that what their point was? Double dipping. I'd have to look at the specifics of it. But if it was something complaining that there's also if someone's complaining about the fact that they're getting carbon offsets as well as conserving, I'd say whatever. Could the Q and layperson speak? I had a discussion, surprising, about forest carbon sequestration. So sequestering carbon in the forest. Oh, they pointed that carbon is already being captured. Okay, here. So I see what you're saying. So the point here, that one, so the question is, I had a surprising discussion about forest carbon sequestration, double dipping to use riparian set aside to meet regulations be used for. So they're saying it was going to be conserved anyway, but then they're getting additional carbon credits as a result of that conservation, right? Okay, so that the answer to that question is additionality, right? So in fact, that is kind of a problem. Riparian areas are areas next to like a creek, like where you have like from the creek into a forest, and there's this kind of like transition area is considered to be riparian wetlands usually. Correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not a wetland guy, but that's usually what you consider to be a riparian area. It's like about 10 feet often in from a river. So with that one here, they have a point. They have a point because it's considered to be additionality. If something was happening anyway, and then you're claiming that it's an additional action to bring in an offset, in fact, that wouldn't qualify for some carbon offsets because it's not an additional effort. Like it's something was happening anyway, and you cannot then say it's an addition. Like there's no additionality. If that makes sense. I can send you a link on additionality in the definition. But if something was going to be exploited anyway, and then you consider that an offset, there's a problem with that. And it's called a lack of additionality. It's not an additional measure. Used message. Thank you. Corey, no problem. No go zones are protected vegetation. Yeah, there's some good stuff on that. There's some good literature out there on that. But you got to be careful. And like if you look at carbon forests processes and regulations, it's very. And the other thing is leakage, right? So the other big problem with forest carbon is leakage, meaning that okay, let's go and conserve all this rainforest, right? And lock it off and blah blah blah. Everybody gets paid, and guess what happened? Like next to it, it gets deforested. That's called leakage. And there's concerns about that. You say, look, we're going to conserve all this stuff, and then it gets destroyed. So it's an issue. Leakage and additionality are big issues in this kind of projects. You need to defend, you need to explain how you're going to deal with both of those. Any other questions? I had to promote commodification, but I hate to promote commodification, but it is a way to create benefits. For example, in Yukon, when huge areas set aside from oil and gas exploration, commodification at least offers a way to offset the lost revenues and funding rules. Yes. Yeah, I agree with you. I guess my question is, who is going to be paying for carbon taxation? There's an increasing inequality. Further taxation could just increase the same. Well, who's going to pay for carbon taxation? You'll pay. I'll pay. Society pays. That's how it works. We pay an increased amount. What about companies? The idea of carbon taxation is to make the commodity that pollutes, like gasoline, more expensive so it's used less. It's an economic disincentive. And then you're supposed to take that money and then put it into like renewable projects such you can foster innovation. That's ideally what happens, but it doesn't always work that way. What about companies that aid carbon offsets by planting trees for feed? Do these work? Yep, fine. Go plant a huge amount of trees. It's okay, especially on degraded land. Plant a forest. You got to use the right protocol though. If it's not done, and it's not done properly and monitored, then I'd say no. Simply not following those who exploit as an oil company that profits. Yes, I agree with you, but at the same time, we consume these things, right? So it's a social phenomenon. I do agree with you that no, you get a combination of that's why you cap and trade. I think is a good combination with carbon taxation. There's caps on certain industries, and then you get the general consumption tax. Will adjust consumption. It will force its economics. It will force the different behaviors, right? That's what happens. Some really good papers on it, like the efficacy of carbon in BC particularly. It's been a success in BC, irrefutable success. I'll post one of those papers. All right, cool. Thanks again. Your time is appreciated by all. Well, it's my pleasure. Just doing my job. More than that, I like it. I want you guys to get the real stuff. The real experience. It's important for you to know about. I don't want you to get caught. Hopefully none of you got screamed at by a pygmy. It's not enjoyable. Or anybody. But we sorted that one out. All good. I'm good with the pygmies now. It's all response spectrum. You betcha, Corey. I'm with you. All right, so I'm gonna close off with our friends Sash and Jiggy. Oh, you want to request old school rap for next week's lecture, okay? How old school? Give me like an example. Are we talking like NWA old school, Notorious B.I.G., Run DMC? I'm open to whatever. I think I get in trouble for NWA. Public Enemy, done. Flavor Flav. Okay, old school rap next week. That's my incentive for you to come out. At least you get music you like. And I think I delivered this week. Sash and Biggie's classic stuff. All right, take it easy. Have a good night. Also consider compiling playlists from all of the. Okay, it's my next project. EDM. Old school rap next week. That's done. Think about the following week. All right, night, guys.